Picture a suburban garage in Los Altos, California, 1976. The air smells of solder and possibility. Two young men, one a technical wizard, the other a visionary dreamer, are about to change the world. This is where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak launched Apple I, not as the sleek tech giant we know today, but as a bare circuit board that required buyers to hand-assemble it themselves. They priced it at $666.66, a number Jobs chose simply because he liked repeating digits. It was sold primarily to hobbyists of the Homebrew Computer Club, a gathering of tech enthusiasts who represented the bleeding edge of what personal computing could become. About 50 brave pioneers bought that first machine, building their own keyboards and displays, creating something tangible from raw potential. But the real magic was just beginning to brew. By 1977, the partnership had evolved. Jobs understood something Wozniak didn't quite grasp yet, that technology needed to seduce people, not just solve problems. When they launched the Apple II that year, priced at $1,298, it wasn't just another computer. It featured color graphics at a time when competitors offered only monochrome displays. More importantly, it came with VisiCalc, the world's first spreadsheet program, which would become what the industry calls a killer app, software so compelling that people buy the hardware just to use it. Jobs insisted on encasing Wozniak's brilliant engineering in a sleek plastic case, transforming what could have been another hobbyist toy into something that belonged in homes and offices. The result? 6 million units sold by 1993, an astonishing run for any product. That spreadsheet program, VisiCalc, became the catalyst for explosive growth. By 1980, Apple's revenue had rocketed to $150 million. The company was no longer two guys in a garage. It was a phenomenon. On December 12, 1980, Apple went public, raising $100 million at $22 per share. Overnight, Steve Jobs became a billionaire at just 25 years old, one of the youngest self-made billionaires in history. But success comes with complications. The partnership between Jobs and Wozniak began to show strain. Wozniak, always the engineer at heart, crashed his plane and stepped back from daily operations, while Jobs pushed forward with increasingly ambitious visions. Now let's fast forward to what should have been Apple's next triumph, the Macintosh. In 1984, during the Super Bowl, millions of Americans saw one of the most famous commercials ever made. It channeled George Orwell's dystopian novel, 1984, showing a young woman hurling a hammer at a screen displaying Big Brother, symbolizing IBM's dominance. The message was clear. Apple would liberate us from conformity. The ad was brilliant. The product, more complicated. The Macintosh launched at $2,495, but it shipped with only 128 kilobytes of RAM, laughably inadequate even then. While Jobs had brilliantly adapted the graphical user interface and mouse from a visit to Xerox PARC's research facility, the Mac couldn't compete with IBM PC clones on price or functionality. The launch stumbled. Jobs ended up firing 20% of the staff in the aftermath, a brutal admission that vision alone couldn't guarantee success. But before the Mac, there was an even more painful lesson in the form of the Apple Lisa, launched in 1983. Named either after Jobs' daughter or as an acronym for Local Integrated Software Architecture, depending on who you ask, the Lisa pioneered the graphical user interface for personal computers. It was revolutionary, beautiful, and priced at $9,995, which made it commercially dead on arrival. The Lisa represented everything Jobs loved about pushing boundaries, but a price point that alienated the very consumers he wanted to reach. Worse, it was cannibalized by the cheaper Macintosh that followed. The Lisa's failure led to Jobs being ousted from the Mac team amid increasingly bitter board clashes. The visionary was becoming a liability. Here's a remarkable footnote to this origin story. In 2014, one of those original Apple I computers, remember, the bare board sold for $666.66, fetched $905,000 at auction. That single sale price represents the extraordinary journey from hobby project to cultural artifact. But it also illustrates the fundamental tension in that early partnership. Jobs prioritized design and market appeal. Wozniak loved simplicity and technical elegance. The Apple II represented their perfect synthesis, peaking in 1983 with a remarkable 25% market share in personal computers. But that balance wouldn't last. Let's return to that pivotal moment in 1975 at a homebrew computer club meeting. Wozniak brought a wooden prototype of what would become the Apple I. The gathered hobbyists were impressed by the engineering, but it was Jobs who saw something more, a market, a movement, a revolution waiting to happen. He convinced Wozniak they should start a company. To fund the first production run of 100 boards, Jobs sold his Volkswagen bus and Wozniak sold his beloved HP calculator. They scraped together enough for components and literally slept on the floor of that garage while they worked through the night. Mike Markula, a former Intel marketing manager, saw the potential and invested $250,000, formalizing Apple Computer Incorporated as a real company with real backing. But the road to success has always been littered with Apple's own wreckage. In 1981, the company launched the Apple III, designed to capture the business market. It was an unmitigated disaster. The machine suffered from terrible thermal problems. Boards literally melted inside the case because Jobs had insisted on a design with no cooling fan. He believed fans were inelegant, and his infamous reality distortion field, his ability to convince people that impossible deadlines and impractical specifications were achievable, couldn't override the laws of physics. The Apple III's failure killed the company's business market momentum just as the IBM PC was gaining traction. By 1981, Apple's revenue had climbed to $150 million, but profits swung wildly as products hit or missed their marks. Jobs recognized he needed experience management, so he recruited John Sculley from PepsiCo as CEO in 1983 with the famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Sculley joined, but he and Jobs would soon clash over the company's direction. That hire planted the seeds of Jobs' eventual exile from the company he'd founded. The visionary who'd started everything in a garage would soon find himself on the outside looking in, watching his creation continue without him. This opening chapter of Apple's story teaches us that revolutionary companies aren't born perfect. They're forged through partnership, conflict, spectacular failures, and the occasional triumph. Jobs and Wozniak created something unprecedented, but they also learned that innovation requires more than brilliant ideas. It demands understanding markets, managing costs, and sometimes accepting that your vision needs to bend to reality. The garage startup was becoming something bigger, messier, and far more complex than two friends building computers for fun. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a visionary is to lose everything. In 1985, Steve Jobs found himself in an impossible position. The board of directors, the very people who were supposed to support him, sided with John Sculley, the CEO Jobs himself had recruited. The Macintosh Wars, as they came to be known, had reached a breaking point. Jobs was fired from Apple, the company he'd co-founded in that Los Altos garage just 9 years earlier. Imagine that for a moment, being expelled from your own creation, your life's work, by people you'd brought in to help you succeed. Jobs sold his stake, 11% of Apple, for $100 million. With $7 million of those dollars, he founded a new company called Next. And with another $5 million, he acquired a small computer graphics division from George Lucas's film empire. That division was called Pixar. At the time, no one could have predicted that these two seemingly desperate moves would reshape not just Jobs' future, but the entire landscape of technology and entertainment. Let's start with Next, because this is where Jobs began rebuilding himself as a leader. In 1988, Next launched the Next Cube, a machine that was almost absurdly ambitious. Priced at $6,500, it ran on Unix with a mock kernel, featured object-oriented programming capabilities, and included a digital signal processing chip that was years ahead of its time. The cube was gorgeous, a perfect magnesium cube encased in black, the kind of machine you display as sculpture. But it was also expensive, niche, and struggled to find a market. Yet here's the remarkable thing: Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN in Switzerland, used a Next computer to build the World Wide Web, the very first web browser and editor. The technology Jobs created during his exile became the platform for inventing the modern internet. Think about that. While Apple continued without him, Jobs was quietly enabling the next revolution in computing. Meanwhile, Pixar was a completely different journey. Jobs had bought this computer graphics division thinking he'd sell high-end graphics computers. That business went nowhere. But Pixar had something else, a team of brilliant animators led by John Lasseter, and a dream of making computer-animated films. Jobs invested heavily, ultimately pouring $50 million into Pixar over the years, far more than his initial $5 million purchase. There were moments when he nearly shut it down, when the losses seemed insurmountable. But in 1995, everything changed. Pixar released Toy Story, the world's first fully computer-generated animated feature film. It grossed $373 million globally and changed cinema forever. That $5 million investment? Jobs eventually sold Pixar to Disney in 2006 for $7.4 billion, making him Disney's largest individual shareholder with 7.5% of the company. From exile and humiliation to one of the most successful entertainment deals in history. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. During those wilderness years, Next was losing money, ultimately burning through $250 million. Yet even in failure, Jobs was learning lessons that would define Apple's future success. Next pioneered elegant hardware and software integration, refusing to compromise on the relationship between the two. The development tools, particularly Interface Builder, were revolutionary, making it dramatically easier for programmers to create sophisticated applications. Jobs attracted extraordinary talent, including Avi Tevanian, who would later become Apple's chief software technology officer. Next wasn't a commercial success, but it was an education, one Jobs paid for dearly, but one that would prove invaluable. Pixar taught Jobs something even more important: humility. At Apple, he'd been the autocratic genius, demanding and dismissive. At Pixar, he learned to collaborate. He worked alongside Ed Catmull and John Lasseter, creative geniuses in their own right, and discovered that his role wasn't to dictate every detail but to enable brilliance in others. When Pixar faced near bankruptcy before Toy Story's release, Jobs greenlit Monsters Incorporated, trusting his team's creative instincts even when the financial risk was enormous. John Lasseter later said that Jobs gave Pixar its soul, not by controlling the creative process, but by protecting it, by believing in it when no one else would. This was a different Steve Jobs, refined by failure and financial pressure into something more than he'd been before. And then there's the technical legacy. Next Step, the operating system Jobs developed at Next, didn't disappear when the hardware business failed. It lived on, evolving, waiting. When Jobs eventually returned to Apple, Next Step would become the foundation for Mac OS X, powering everything from the Apple Store's back-end infrastructure to the iPhones in your pocket today. Technology Jobs built in exile became the engine of Apple's renaissance. But we're getting ahead of the story again. During this period, Jobs' personal life evolved too. He dated Tina Reds, a relationship that was passionate but ultimately couldn't survive his intensity. Then he met Laurene Powell at Stanford, where he'd been invited to give a lecture. They married in 1991, right in the middle of his exile years. Laurene provided stability, partnership that could weather Jobs' impossible standards in mercurial moods. This personal grounding mattered more than it might seem. The Jobs who would eventually return to Apple was not just technically wiser but emotionally more stable, with a family anchoring him. By 1990, Next tried to right the ship. The Next station launched at a more accessible $4,995, attempting to find a broader market. The company managed to sell about 50,000 units, but the hardware business simply couldn't generate sustainable profits. In 1992, Jobs made a difficult decision. Next would abandon hardware entirely and pivot to software only, licensing Next Step to other computer manufacturers. It was an admission of defeat, but also a pragmatic recognition of where the company's true value lay. Jobs hand-delivered some Next computers to CERN himself, bonding with the scientists there, understanding how his tools were enabling discoveries that transcended commercial success. These exile years also changed Jobs spiritually and intellectually. He read Zen philosophy extensively, traveled, contemplated the nature of work and meaning. The aggressive, impatient young man who'd been fired was slowly becoming someone more reflective, more strategic. Next valuation peaked at $2 billion despite having sold fewer than 100,000 machines. Investors weren't betting on current success, but on Jobs himself, on the potential he represented. That faith would prove justified. By 1996, Apple was in desperate trouble. The company Jobs had left 11 years earlier was now circling bankruptcy, hemorrhaging market share to Windows PCs, releasing unfocused products that excited no one. They needed an operating system strategy for the future. After evaluating several options, Apple acquired Next for $429 million in stock, bringing Jobs back as an advisor. That same year, Pixar went public, and the offering made Jobs a billionaire again, this time through animation rather than computers. The exiled founder was returning, but not as the brash 25-year-old who'd been pushed out. He was coming back as someone who'd survived failure, who'd built successful companies in two entirely different industries, who'd learned to balance vision with collaboration. The wilderness years weren't just an interlude in Jobs' story. They were the crucible that forged the leader Apple would need to become the most valuable company in the world. Every setback at Next taught him what not to do. Every success at Pixar showed him how to build culture and trust creative teams. The humiliation of being fired, the financial pressure of keeping failing companies alive, the joy of unexpected triumph, all of it was preparing Jobs for a comeback that would defy every expectation. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're truly capable of becoming. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he didn't walk into a company, he walked into chaos. Apple had become a bloated mess, producing dozens of confusing products that competed with each other and excited no one. The company was bleeding cash, hemorrhaging talent, and most analysts expected it to collapse entirely within months. Jobs took the title interim CEO. People started calling him the ICO and immediately did something shocking. He took a machete to Apple's product line, slashing 70% of everything they were making. He reduced the entire company to 4 products: consumer desktop, professional desktop, consumer laptop, professional laptop. That's it. Thousands of employees, 3,000 people, lost their jobs. It was brutal. It was necessary. And then Jobs did something even more surprising. He called Microsoft, Apple's arch-nemesis, and made a deal. Bill Gates agreed to invest $150 million in Apple and commit to developing Office for Mac. That cash injection, combined with ruthless focus, bought Apple time to attempt the impossible, a comeback. The first sign that something magical was happening came in 1998 with the iMac G3. If you were alive then, you remember the shock of seeing it for the first time. Everything about it defied the rules of computing. It was translucent, made of bondy blue plastic that looked like candy. You could see the components inside. There was no floppy drive. Jobs declared them dead technology, even though everyone said customers needed them. It was priced at $1,299, and it sold 800,000 units in the first 5 months. The Think Different campaign launched alongside it, featuring black and white photographs of visionaries like Einstein, Gandhi, and Muhammad Ali, with a tagline celebrating the crazy ones who changed the world. That campaign wasn't just advertising. It was Apple declaring its identity, claiming kinship with revolutionaries. By the end of the first year, 5 million iMacs had sold. The computer that looked like no other computer had saved Apple from extinction. But Jobs understood something profound. Computers alone wouldn't be enough. The future wasn't just about what happened on your desk. It was about what you carried in your pocket, what lived in your living room, what connected your entire digital life. In October 2001, Jobs introduced the iPod. It was a small white device with a scroll wheel and 5 gigabytes of storage, enough for 1,000 songs in your pocket, as Jobs proclaimed. It cost $399, which seemed expensive for a music player, but connected to your Mac through FireWire, synced instantly, and worked flawlessly. Then, in 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Store, and suddenly you could legally buy individual songs for 99 cents each. The first week, they sold 1 million songs. The iPod wasn't just a music player. It was the beginning of Apple controlling the entire experience, hardware, software, and now the content itself. This was ecosystem strategy at its most elegant. iTunes synced your Mac with your iPod, creating a seamless loop that locked users into Apple's world, not through contracts or force, but through sheer convenience and delight. Apple expanded the iPod line aggressively. The Nano in 2005, sleek and impossibly thin, the iPod Video that same year, letting you watch movies on that tiny screen, and the iPod Touch in 2007, which added apps and a touchscreen, serving as a preview of what was coming next. Each iteration deepened the ecosystem, made it harder to leave, and made every Apple product more valuable because it worked perfectly with all your other Apple products. Underneath all of this consumer magic, something equally important was happening. In 2001, Apple released Mac OS X, an operating system that merged the rock-solid stability of Next Step that system Jobs had developed during his exile years with a friendly interface Mac users loved. It was Unix under the hood, powerful enough for professionals, beautiful enough for everyone. Jobs also changed Apple's culture in ways both symbolic and practical. He banned suits at Apple, mandating sneakers and jeans instead. He wanted creativity, not corporate conformity. Every decision, every detail reflected his belief that technology should be personal, expressive, emotional, not cold and corporate. Then came one of the most audacious moves, Apple Stores. In 2001, when every computer company sold through third-party retailers, Jobs opened Apple's first flagship retail stores. Industry experts predicted disaster. Apple's problem is it still believes the way to grow is serving caviar in a world that seems pretty content with cheese and crackers, wrote one Businessweek columnist. But Jobs understood something those experts missed. The experience of buying technology mattered. Apple stores featured the Genius Bar, where customers could get help and support. The stores were designed like art galleries, with open tables where you could touch and play with every product. By the 2010s, there were over 500 Apple stores globally, generating over $300 billion in lifetime sales and becoming the most profitable retail square footage in the world. There's a story Jobs loved to tell about the iMac's creation. He sketched the concept on a napkin, translucent, colorful, friendly. His team said computers had to be beige, that's just how they were. Jobs said no, they could be candy colors, Bondi blue first, but eventually lime, strawberry, grape. Why should technology be boring? The iMac represented Jobs' philosophy perfectly. Reject conventions, delight users, make technology that people didn't just use but loved. And the iPod completed this transformation. Jobs called it Apple's digital hub strategy, the Mac at the center, with devices like iPods, cameras, and phones connecting to it. This pivot from Apple Computer to Apple Incorporated meant the company was no longer just about computers, but about devices that enriched your life. By 2007, Apple had sold 100 million iPods. 100 million tiny white devices, each one connecting someone deeper into Apple's ecosystem. Jobs understood that the magic wasn't in any single product, but how they all worked together. Hardware, software, and services forming an unbreakable chain. Apple explicitly rejected Windows parity, refusing to make iTunes or other services work as well on PCs as on Macs. If you wanted the best experience, you needed to be all in with Apple. This wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. Every product became more valuable when you owned other Apple products. In 2006, Jobs sold Pixar to Disney for $7.4 billion, becoming Disney's largest individual shareholder. The animation studio he'd rescued from obscurity had become one of the most successful creative enterprises in history. But Jobs didn't slow down at Apple. He introduced iLife, a suite of creativity tools, iPhoto, iMovie, GarageBand, bundled free with every Mac. Suddenly, everyone was a photographer, a filmmaker, a musician. Apple wasn't just selling technology, it was selling creative empowerment. The numbers tell the turnaround story starkly. When Jobs returned in 1997, Apple's market capitalization was about $5 billion and dropping. By 1999, powered by the iMac's halo effect, people buying iMacs and then wanting other Apple products, the company's market cap had doubled to $10 billion. But this was just the beginning. The iPod explosion, the iTunes Store success, the retail stores, the ecosystem strategy, all of it was building towards something unprecedented. Apple was no longer just surviving. It was beginning to redefine entire industries. The I prefix became iconic: iMac, iPod, iTunes, iLife. Jobs said the I stood for Internet, individual, instruct, inform, inspire. But really, it stood for a philosophy: technology should be personal, intuitive, integrated. Each I product talked to the others, creating experience that transcended any single device. When you bought an iPod, you didn't just buy a music player, you bought entry into an ecosystem that would grow to encompass phones, tablets, watches, and services you couldn't yet imagine. Jobs was building something that wouldn't just compete with other technology companies, but would create its own gravitational field, pulling customers in and never letting them go. Not through coercion, but through excellence that became indispensable. The return was complete. The exile who'd been fired in humiliation had become the architect of one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in business history. But Jobs wasn't satisfied. The iPod had revolutionized music. The stores had revolutionized retail. OS X had revolutionized computing. What else could be revolutionized? What other industry was ripe for the kind of transformation only Apple seemed capable of delivering? The answer was in Jobs' pocket, waiting for the right moment to change everything once again. January 9, 2007. The Moscone Center in San Francisco. Steve Jobs walked onto the stage wearing his signature black turtleneck and jeans, and he was about to unveil something that would change not just Apple, but the entire world. Today, he said with that characteristic pause for drama, we are introducing 3 revolutionary products. The first is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. He repeated this, building tension, then smiled. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we're calling it iPhone. The audience erupted. What Jobs held in his hand was immediately dubbed the Jesus phone by the tech press, a device with multi-touch capacitive glass, no stylus, no keyboard, just a screen that responded to your fingers like magic. In its first year, Apple sold 6.1 million iPhones, a number that dwarfed the company's original iPod sales. The world would never be the same. But the iPhone itself was only half the revolution. In July 2008, Apple launched the App Store, and this is where the ecosystem strategy reached its ultimate expression. On day one, there were 500 apps, simple games, utilities, productivity tools created by third-party developers. Within the first year, the App Store generated $1 billion in revenue. Today, there are over 2 million apps available, and the lifetime ecosystem spend has exceeded $320 billion. Think about that for a moment. Apple created a platform where millions of developers could build businesses, where users could customize their devices in infinite ways, and where Apple took a 30% cut of everything. The App Store didn't just sell software. It created an entirely new economy, one that ran on Apple's infrastructure and enriched the company with every transaction. Behind the iPhone's sleek exterior and revolutionary interface was another kind of mastery, supply chain excellence. This was Tim Cook's domain. While Jobs obsessed over design and user experience, Cook was orchestrating one of the most sophisticated manufacturing operations in human history. Apple partnered with Foxconn for assembly and TSMC for chip fabrication, building relationships that would become nearly unbreakable. Cook implemented just-in-time inventory management so precise that Apple's inventory turned over every 5 days, compared to competitors who held 80 days of inventory or more. This wasn't just efficiency. It was capital deployed elsewhere, cash not tied up in warehouses. Apple locked in suppliers with over $500 billion in capital expenditures, prepaying for components and manufacturing capacity, ensuring that when demand surged, Apple got priority while competitors scrambled for scraps. The iPhone kept evolving at a relentless pace. The Retina display arrived in 2010, packing so many pixels into the screen that your eye couldn't distinguish individual dots. Siri launched in 2011, bringing voice assistance to millions, imperfect, sometimes frustrating, but undeniably futuristic. Face ID arrived in 2018, replacing fingerprint sensors with facial recognition, so sophisticated it worked in the dark and couldn't be fooled by photographs. Not every innovation went smoothly. The iPhone 4's AntennaGate scandal, where holding the phone a certain way blocked the antenna, became a public relations nightmare. Job solution? Free cases for everyone. Problem solved. Lesson learned. Move forward. That's how Apple operated under Jobs. Acknowledge reality. Fix it quickly. Never dwell on failure. What truly separated iPhone from every competitor was vertical integration. Apple designed its own custom A-series processors, starting with the A4 and evolving to the A17 Pro by 2023, which packed 19 billion transistors into a chip smaller than a postage stamp. While Samsung and Qualcomm sold chips to multiple phone makers, Apple's chips worked exclusively in Apple devices, optimized perfectly for iOS. This control over both hardware and software allowed Apple to extract performance that competitors couldn't match, even with technically superior specifications on paper. The result? Gross margins around 50%, unheard of in consumer electronics, possible only through massive scale and vertical control. The iPhone didn't just succeed, it disrupted entire industries. Smartphones killed the iPod, Apple's own revolutionary product cannibalized by something better. They destroyed Nokia, which went from 90% smartphone market share to bankruptcy in less than a decade. By 2025, Apple had shipped approximately 1.5 billion iPhones, commanding about 22% of the global smartphone market. But here's what matters. Apple captured the premium segment so completely that even with just 1/5 of unit sales, they took home nearly all the industry's profits. Everyone else fought over the remaining scraps. There's a story that perfectly captures Jobs' obsession with the iPhone's perfection. Early prototypes used plastic screens. Jobs carried one in his pocket for a few days and found it scratched easily from coins and keys. He demanded glass, but engineers said glass would shatter on impact. Jobs didn't care. Find glass that doesn't shatter, he ordered. They partnered with Corning to develop Gorilla Glass, a material strong enough to survive drops yet clear enough to disappear under your fingers. Jobs shattered dozens of prototypes personally, testing them to destruction, refusing to compromise. Meanwhile, Tim Cook was flying to Asia weekly, sometimes sleeping on factory floors, building relationships with suppliers, understanding every step of the manufacturing process. Jobs provided the vision. Cook provided the execution. Together, they created something unprecedented. The iPhone's success funded Apple's expansion into services, a brilliant strategic move as smartphone sales began to plateau. Apple Music competed with Spotify. Apple Pay turned your phone into a wallet. Apple TV Plus challenged Netflix. These services generated recurring revenue, turning one-time hardware purchases into ongoing relationships. By the 2020s, the iPhone represented about 52% of Apple's revenue, but here's the crucial detail. It generated approximately 80% of profits. The services and other products were important, but the iPhone remained the sun around which everything else orbited. 95% of iPhones were assembled in China, primarily at Foxconn's massive facilities. This created both opportunity and vulnerability. When COVID-19 hit, Apple prioritized Foxconn workers with mask mandates and health protocols, ensuring production continued while competitors shut down. The relationship Apple had built, paying premium prices, providing stable demand, treating suppliers as partners rather than commodities, meant that even during global crises, iPhones kept shipping. This wasn't luck. It was the result of decades of relationship building and strategic investment. The iPhone's success also spawned legal battles. Apple fought patent wars against Samsung, eventually winning over $1 billion in damages for copying the iPhone's multi-touch interface and design elements. But these lawsuits were about more than money. They were defending the ecosystem. Apple introduced iCloud Continuity, where your messages, photos, and apps synced seamlessly across iPhone, iPad, and Mac. Once you were in the ecosystem, leaving meant abandoning that seamless experience. The lock-in wasn't through contracts, but through convenience and integration so thorough that switching to Android felt like moving to a different country where you didn't speak the language. The iPhone era transformed Apple from a computer company into the most valuable company on Earth. It created economic value measured in the trillions when you count app developers, accessory makers, and service providers who built businesses around the iPhone platform. It changed how we communicate, work, navigate, photograph our lives, consume entertainment, and interact with the world. The device in your pocket contains more computing power than the Apollo spacecraft, connects you to all human knowledge, and costs less than a monthly car payment. That's the iPhone's legacy, not just a successful product, but a technology so fundamental that we can barely remember what life was like before it existed. Jobs once said the iPhone was the product he was most proud of, the culmination of everything Apple had learned. It combined the design obsession of the iMac, the ecosystem strategy of the iPod, the retail experience of Apple stores, and the software elegance of OS X into a single device that redefined what technology could be. And Tim Cook ensured that vision could scale to 1 billion users without compromising quality or availability. Together, they built not just a phone, but a platform, one that would carry Apple into the trillion-dollar stratosphere and beyond. When Steve Jobs died on October 5, 2011, the world wondered if Apple could survive without its visionary founder. Tim Cook had been named CEO just months earlier in August, as Jobs' health deteriorated. Cook was Jobs' opposite in almost every way. Calm where Jobs was volatile, methodical where Jobs was intuitive, operational where Jobs was creative. Analysts questioned whether Apple could innovate without its genius at the helm. Wall Street worried. Competitors sensed opportunity. They were all spectacularly wrong. Under Cook's leadership, Apple didn't just survive, it became the first company in history to reach a $1 trillion market capitalization in 2018, then $2 trillion, and by 2025, approximately $3.5 trillion. Cook doubled, then tripled, then nearly quadrupled Apple's value. He did it not through revolutionary products that changed the world overnight, but through operational mastery, strategic expansion, and an understanding that excellence compounds when executed relentlessly over time. Let's talk about what Cook inherited and what he built. When he became CEO, Apple had already achieved remarkable success, but it was essentially a one-product company. The iPhone generated the vast majority of revenue and profit. Cook understood the danger of that dependence. He set about systematically diversifying Apple's business while strengthening its core. The company accumulated a cash hoard that peaked at over $400 billion, more money than many countries' GDP, giving Apple unparalleled flexibility and power. The installed base of active iPhones grew to approximately 2 billion devices by the mid-2020s, each one a potential customer for services, accessories, and future hardware upgrades. In services, this became Cook's masterpiece. Revenue from services, Apple Music, iCloud storage, Apple Pay, App Store commissions, Apple Care, and more grew to over $100 billion annually, representing about 25% of total revenue. But here's what matters. Services carry higher margins than hardware, creating a more predictable, recurring revenue stream that analysts and investors adore. Cook's Apple launched new product categories that Jobs never lived to see. The Apple Watch arrived in 2015, and while critics initially dismissed it as a luxury toy, it became the world's best-selling smartwatch, with over 50 million units sold annually by the 2020s. It wasn't just a timepiece, it was a health monitoring device that could detect irregular heart rhythms, measure blood oxygen, track sleep patterns, and even detect falls and call for help. Then came AirPods in 2016, those wireless earbuds that looked strange at first but quickly became ubiquitous. Apple captured approximately 20% of the entire wireless earbud market, turning a simple accessory into a multi-billion-dollar business. The Fitness Plus subscription service bundled health data across devices, creating a moat around Apple's ecosystem, your workout data, health trends, and fitness goals all living within Apple's walled garden, making it progressively harder to leave for a competitor's platform. But Cook's most ambitious bet arrived in 2024, the Vision Pro, Apple's entry into augmented and virtual reality. Priced at $3,499, it was expensive even by Apple standards, but it represented something profound, spatial computing, where digital content blends seamlessly with the physical world. At launch, there were 600 apps available, and while initial sales were modest, Apple was clearly playing a long game. This was about establishing the platform for whatever comes after smartphones, whether we call it the metaverse, augmented reality, or something we haven't named yet. Jobs had always said Apple's strategy was to build the intersection of technology and liberal arts. The Vision Pro was that philosophy extended into 3 dimensions, literally. One of Cook's most significant strategic decisions was the privacy pivot. In 2021, Apple introduced app tracking transparency, requiring apps to explicitly ask permission before tracking users across other apps and websites. Facebook and the entire digital advertising industry howled in protest. The change cut ad revenue for these companies by an estimated 10% industry-wide. Apple absorbed criticism, lawsuits, and political pressure. But here's what happened. Consumer trust in Apple strengthened. Privacy became a competitive advantage, a reason to choose iPhone over Android. Cook testified before Congress, gave interviews, and repeatedly stated that privacy is a fundamental human right. This wasn't just marketing, it was a strategic repositioning that differentiated Apple in an era when big tech faced mounting scrutiny over data practices. Geopolitically, Cook navigated waters that would have destroyed lesser executives. As U.S.-China relations deteriorated and tariffs threatened Apple's supply chain, Cook worked both sides masterfully. Apple committed to buying $250 billion worth of American products, soybeans, steel, other commodities, essentially functioning as a diplomatic bridge between the world's two largest economies. Simultaneously, Cook diversified manufacturing away from over-reliance on China. By 2025, Apple was producing approximately 25 million iPhones annually in India through partnerships with Foxconn and Tata. The company also committed to a $50 billion chip fabrication plant in Texas in partnership with TSMC, bringing advanced semiconductor manufacturing back to American soil. These weren't just business decisions, they were geopolitical strategy, ensuring Apple's supply chain resilience while maintaining crucial relationships in both countries. Perhaps Cook's most underappreciated triumph was Apple Silicon. In 2020, Apple launched the M1 chip, ditching Intel processors that had powered Macs for 15 years in favor of custom-designed ARM-based processors. The industry was skeptical. ARM chips were for phones, not real computers, they said. But the M1 delivered approximately twice the efficiency of Intel chips, running cooler, lasting longer on battery, and performing better across most workloads. This wasn't just a technical achievement. It was vertical integration reaching its logical conclusion. Apple now controlled the silicon, the operating system, the applications, and the services, every layer of the stack optimized to work together. When your entire product line runs on processors you designed specifically for your software, you achieve performance and efficiency impossible for competitors cobbling together parts from multiple vendors. Cook's Apple also faced unprecedented regulatory scrutiny. The European Union's Digital Markets Act resulted in fines exceeding $2 billion, targeting Apple's App Store policies and alleged anti-competitive behavior. But Apple adapted, sidestepping the strictest requirements through clever technical workarounds like progressive web apps that delivered app-like experiences through browsers, bypassing App Store restrictions. Services achieved remarkable 40% profit margins, compared to 35% on hardware, proof that Cook's diversification strategy was working. The App Store alone became one of the most profitable businesses in human history, generating tens of billions annually with minimal marginal cost for each additional transaction. Not every bet paid off. Project Titan, Apple's secretive automotive initiative, was reportedly canceled in 2024 after years of development and billions in investment. Apple concluded that building cars wasn't the opportunity it once seemed, shifting focus instead to software and autonomous systems that could be licensed to automakers. There were rumors of AR glasses arriving around 2027, lighter and more accessible than the Vision Pro, but these remain speculative. Cook's Apple was willing to explore, invest heavily, and then kill projects that didn't meet the company's standards, a discipline that prevented resources from being wasted on mediocre products. Sustainability became central to Apple's identity under Cook in ways it never had under Jobs. By 2025, Apple achieved 100% recycled cobalt in its batteries, part of a broader commitment to become entirely carbon neutral across its supply chain and product lifecycle. The company participated in initiatives to plant 1 trillion trees globally, offsetting emissions while generating positive PR. Cook understood that younger consumers cared deeply about environmental responsibility, and Apple's sustainability efforts became another differentiator, another reason to justify premium pricing. This wasn't greenwashing. Apple published detailed environmental reports, held suppliers accountable, and invested in recycling technology like the Daisy robot that could disassemble iPhones to recover precious materials. In 2020, Cook testified before Congress during antitrust hearings, defending the App Store against accusations that it constituted an illegal monopoly. He remained calm, data-driven, and persuasive, arguing that the App Store created opportunities for millions of developers while maintaining security and privacy standards that benefited users. Whether these arguments will ultimately prevail in courts around the world remains uncertain, but Cook's performance demonstrated why he's been so successful. He can navigate political, regulatory, and public relations challenges with the same operational excellence he brings to supply chain management. The Cook era proved that Apple didn't need jobs to thrive. It needed the foundation jobs built, combined with world-class operational execution. Cook took the creative vision and translated it into sustainable, scalable, diversified excellence. He expanded Apple's product line without diluting the brand. He grew services revenue without alienating hardware customers. He navigated geopolitical tensions without compromising Apple's access to crucial markets. He made privacy a competitive advantage rather than a cost center. And through it all, the stock price climbed relentlessly upward, creating more wealth for shareholders than perhaps any other company in history. Critics say Cook's Apple lacks the revolutionary magic of Jobs' era. They're not entirely wrong. There's been no iPhone-level disruption, no single product that changed the world overnight. But Cook's genius lies elsewhere, in the compound effect of many smart decisions, in the relentless pursuit of operational excellence, in understanding that sustained success over decades requires different skills than the burst of creative genius that launches revolutions. Jobs was the artist. Cook is the architect, building structures that endure, expand, and evolve. Together, one in life, one in legacy, they created something unprecedented, a company that mastered both innovation and execution, vision and operations, disruption and durability. By 2025, Apple under Cook had become more than a technology company. It was a financial powerhouse, diplomatic entity, cultural force, and the most valuable publicly traded company in history. The garage startup that began with two young men hand-assembling circuit boards had become a $3.5 trillion colossus that shaped how billions of people communicate, work, create, and live. And the man leading it, the quiet, methodical executive who never sought the spotlight, had proven that operational excellence, executed with discipline and vision over time, can be just as transformative as revolutionary genius.